Hello and welcome to this video on how to paint the ultramarines, painting the Legion the 13th. In this video we will learn how to apply a zenithal highlight, how to create an ultramarine blue that really pops, how to apply simple weathering, and how to apply decals to our miniatures. To begin with, we need a good pre-coat, so we start with Opaque White by Medea Comart, and this is undiluted. When we apply this, we want to maximize the volumes of the piece. Now the first coat won't give us that very strong contrast. It will look quite grey once finished. It's important that we add this layer first, allow it to dry, and then we reapply a second layer to boost the contrast. Overall, we will end up with a miniature that looks like it's been painted in grayscale. So all the shadows, all the lights, if you run it through a filter and it created a black and white image, this is what it would create. Kanto blue is then applied across the entirety of the miniature. This is thinned down 1 to 3 paint thinner. We are using life color thinner. We want a very dilute overall coverage to the miniature. We still want to see the bare bones, the skeleton of that pre-coat showing through. Next up, this is the stage I like calling double dipping the chip. You get twice cooked chips. This is what this technique feels like. Okay, next up we mix in Medea Comart White into the Kanto Blue already in the cup of the airbrush. And we're looking at roughly 50-50. Now, when we apply this to our previous colour, you may be worried you won't be able to recreate this across an entire force. We aren't really looking for the pigmentation on this paint. Rather, we are looking for the value. And value is a scale between black and white. So don't worry about consistency. Subsequent layers will help make a coherent overall image. Reinforce the very top highlights that we developed in our first pass with the airbrush. And this should give us a rather washed out looking blue, but something that we can work on top of to develop the depth. Leviathan Blue from Games Workshop is then applied across the entirety of the miniature. This is thinned down roughly 1 part paint to 2 parts thinner. The airbrush is running at 20 psi. I do not change that during the process. It's always at a consistent psi of 20. If I want to modulate the amount of paint coming through the airbrush, it's done with trigger control. Developing trigger control is easy enough to do. Easy enough to do, hard to master. Have a look at the essentials range for tips and exercises on improving your own trigger control. Leviathan Blue is then applied across all the shadows of the piece and edged carefully into the upper midtones. Primarily this is meant to deepen the shadows. And weirdly enough, if you're painting Night Lords, this might be quite a good place to stop, right here. Because it does give a really nice desaturated low value blue. So desaturated, there's lots of black and white in the mixture, there's not much saturation, there's not much purity of colour. And low value means it's quite dark in the shadows and quite light in the highlights. Next up, to make it look like an actual ultramarine rather than a Night Lord, we use Adriatic Blue. So this is a turquoise colour, and this is thinned roughly 1 part Adriatic Blue to 3 parts thinner. You'll notice that thinner always goes into the airbrush first. Never ever put the paint in first. Always use thinner. Always put the thinner in first before any paint is mixed up. Okay, this overlaps the highlight and is feathered into the midtone. This is a very thin layer. We aren't looking for a dramatic shift in tone right now. Instead, this is done by building up 2 to 3 successive layers, one on top of another. Because the paint is so thin, it does dry very quickly. There's no need necessarily to resort to using a hairdryer in between the layers. If you're working in bulk, which this series is being designed for, This series of articles, videos, has been designed to produce bulk miniatures. Once you've painted one, you should be doing them in batches of 20. Once you've painted one, you could come back to the first one and it'll be dry. Okay, the final layer of Cantor Blue is thinned down, roughly 1 part paint to 3 parts thinner. This is a very, very thinned down glaze, and this is applied over the mid-tone. This is to re-energize that mid-tone and help unite that disparate highlight to the shadow. Okay, put the airbrush away, clean it up, time to move over to the brush. Necro Gold from Scale 75 is applied to all the metallic trim and gold areas. Thamar Black is applied to the rubberized seals of the armour, and Dark Aluminium is applied to the metallic areas such as the gun and backpack. Leviathan Blue is very, very carefully applied in between the joints of the armour to help separate them. Now for this you want to use a good brush. For this I'm using the Rosemary & Co. number 0. Comes to a very fine tapered tip, but it also has a really nice belly to carry moisture and allow the paint to remain wetter for longer, so you get a really nice transition off the tip of the brush onto your miniature. You can help yourself here if you're painting en masse and you want a slightly neater result, because if you paint in 20 of these, it does tend to cramp up your arm. Use a gloss varnish over the miniature first, and that will help the paint flow into those gaps and recesses. Okay, Adriatic Blue is then used with a pinch of white mixed in randomly, because all scratches should be random, and this is applied with a sponge onto the very top hard edges of the armor plate. Wherever you traditionally add an edge highlight, that's where you want to concentrate the chipping. Now we need very little paint on the palette. There's no moisture whatsoever in this sponge, and the paint itself should be quite dry. If you have used the dry brush technique where you remove 90% of the moisture from the pigment on the brush, this is a similar kind of feeling. We should struggle to impart any sort of paint from the sponge onto the miniature. To break things up even further, I've resorted to using my brush just to add the odd scratch here and there. Now, it's very easy to become lost in this sort of hyper detailing, but it's one of my favourite aspects of simple weathering. Now this replaces an edge highlight. The sponge chipping helps define the lines of the miniature and also adds realism to the piece. I blacken the eyelids and I don't paint them any further. Next up, silver from Vallejo Air is sponged onto the top portions of the gun casing and along the gun metallic areas itself. This gives the impression of a highlight to the gun casing and scratches, all done in one fell swoop. I also add a light silver few touches here and there onto the gold itself to add an artificial highlight. I can also add in patches on the armour itself, again to help break it up and introduce more textures into the armour itself. Reichland Flesh Shade, I always want to put an S in there. Reichland Flesh Shade is then added into the shadows of the gold to warm it up. And we have a painted marine. Base as you see fit. Now for the decals, we need to apply a gloss varnish to the areas that you wish to apply the decals. We use micro set on the surface, wipe it across, and then we use warm water to separate the decal image from the backing sheet, and we very carefully apply it to the backing. So gloss, micro set, decal, and then micro sol afterwards. I always get them mixed up. It's the blue one first. I could keep that in my head. As long as I know the color key, I will be fine. Next up, we use an earbud to help soften the image further, to help press it down onto the miniature to make sure there's no irregular edges. Now sometimes it will slip, like it will in a second. No need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Simply take a knife or equally hard-edged object and help finesse it back into place. reapply the microsol on top, which is a softening agent. It will help dissolve the varnish and help create a more secure bind onto the miniature. Feel free to apply a matte varnish over the top of this to help dull the coat. And that's it, an ultramarine. Thank you very much guys for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye 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 bye.